You know how some serial offenders get nicknames like the Zodiac Killer, BTK, and Night Stalker? Names that almost kind of sound theatrical. Yeah, well, Israel Keys never got that. There's no catchy label for him, there's no Netflix drama, and that somehow makes him even more terrifying. Because Israel Keys wasn't chasing fame, he was avoiding attention. He didn't have a type, he didn't leave clues, he literally buried kids across the country. Buckets filled with cash, tools, restraints, years before using them. He would travel across the country, dig one up, and look for a stranger to target. No motive, no pattern, no warning. And for years, nobody had any idea. So, if you're here for a story that's one of the most strategic and unpredictable criminal minds in recent history, buckle in. This one's gonna be unsettling. So let's rewind. Israel Keys was born in 1978 in Utah. He was the second of 10 kids and raised in a strict, isolated household. You know, the kind where every book, every conversation, and influence came from inside the house. The family eventually shifted from mainstream religion to an extreme, off grid belief system. They moved to the woods in Washington and lived without any electricity, running water, homeschooled the kids, and preached that the outside world was corrupt and dangerous. Oh, and their neighbors? Yeah, one of the families they got close to would later be tied to a series of violent crimes tied to hate groups. So Keys was growing up around weapons, paranoia, and radical beliefs. And it gets even darker. Even as a young teen, Keys showed some of the signs that something was a little off. He would disappear into the forest for hours alone and then would admit later that he harmed animals, especially cats, for fun. There's one specific story involving a tree and a 22 rifle that I will not repeat in detail, but just know that it was bad. At some point later in his teens, he rejected the religious upbringing that he had completely. He started mocking it and calling himself an atheist, but also he was careful. He didn't advertise his shift, he knew when to play the part when needed. The ability to blend in, yeah, that would become his signature. Later into his life, at around 20 years old, Keys joined the military. He was stationed in Washington, then moved to Egypt, and then Texas. And here is the weird part. He was really good at it. There was no red flags. He kept his head down, followed orders, even drank and joked around with other soldiers. He had a reputation for being quiet but super likable. While the army gave him structure and discipline, he was also learning how to operate in complete secrecy. Keys had a personal rule book, and he didn't want to be the other headline serial killers. No calling cards and no signature, no stalking people in his hometown, no choosing victims he knew. He once said something that still haunts me. He said, "If I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do it right." And by right, he meant invisible, undetectable, and efficient. He wanted to cause chaos without leaving a footprint. And it worked. For a really, really, really long time, it worked. Now we're going to get into one of the most disturbing parts of this story, the part that sets him aside from every other serial killer, the kits. Israel Keys didn't just wake up one day, grab a weapon, and go looking for trouble. He planned years in advance. He would fly to one state, rent a car, drive hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles, bury a 5-gallon Home Depot bucket inside of the bucket, duct tape, zip ties, gloves, a gun, silencer, ammunition, bleach, rope, trash bags, a shovel, cash, and sometimes a tool to break into people's houses. And then he would leave it there, fly home, go back like nothing happened, go back to work, being a boyfriend, and just wait. For years, he would wait sometimes. And then eventually, whenever the moment would feel right to him, he would go back, dig it up, and then he would start driving around and looking for somebody. What is just absolutely crazy and chilling about this is most killers don't have this kind of patience. They're impulsive. They do it when they want and when they need. They don't wait, they don't plan, especially not for years. He looked for the perfect opportunity: isolation and convenience. He once even told the FBI, "I'd look for places where people were just vulnerable, a house with no car in the driveway, or a trail where someone's hiking alone." The part in particular that keeps me up at night is those kits are still buried out there. How many kits are still out there that we don't even know of? To this day, the FBI believes there are unrecovered kits buried in the US, and we only found the ones that Keyes admitted to, which was not many. He mentioned kits in New York, Texas, Washington, and possibly Arizona. But he also often took trips to places like Vermont, Maine, Wyoming, and Utah, often with no clear reason. He didn't always strike right away. Sometimes he'd bury a kit and wait 5 or 6 years to use it. One of the kits discovered was buried in 2009, and he didn't return to that kit until 2011. That alone is what made him so hard to catch. There was no string of crimes. There was no surge of violence that tipped off investigators. Just quiet, hidden, well-timed disappearances that spread across the US with no clear connection. And the kits weren't just for murder. He used them for home invasions, bank robberies, arson. Yeah, that's right. He also robbed banks. He would fund his travels by hitting small town branches with minimal security, usually on the edge of town. Walk in, armed, face covered, cash in hand, out in under 3 minutes. And just like with his other crimes, he wasn't in it for the thrill. He wasn't trying to hurt the bank employees. He just needed money for gas, hotels, and flights to keep the double life going. At the time of his arrest, no one suspected a thing. His friends said he was helpful, quiet. His partner described him as a great dad. His coworkers thought that he was polite and hardworking, and meanwhile, he was hiding the darkest secrets imaginable. And all that we've talked about so far with Israel Keyes' background and his chilling level of preparation, the one thing that makes him so haunting even today is we still don't know how many people he hurt. The FBI has tied him to at least 3 murders, but he has hinted at so many more. He refused to name names or locations in some cases. He wanted to control the story, even from behind bars. But let's go down the cases we do know, and we'll start with the one that ultimately brought him down: Samantha Koenig. In Anchorage, Alaska, February 1st, 2012, 18-year-old Samantha Koenig was working the evening shift at a coffee stand called Common Grounds. You know, those little drive-up espresso huts, super common in Alaska, small, cozy, usually run by one person. That night, it was just Samantha alone, finishing her shift at around 8 p.m. Security cameras show a man approach the window. He orders his coffee. At first, it's normal, but after a few seconds, he pulls a gun, climbs through the window, and forces Samantha outside. Keyes led her away at gunpoint, and here's where it gets even worse. He took her back to his truck, zip-tied her hands, and drove her to his house. The entire time, his daughter and his girlfriend were at his house. He left Samantha tied up in his shed outside, and he told the FBI that he turned the radio up loud to cover any sounds. Then he went back inside the house, acting like nothing happened. The next morning, he SA'd her and then ended her life. And if that isn't horrifying enough, he then left her body in a storage shed, turned the heat down low so it wouldn't decompose quickly, and flew to New Orleans for a 2-week cruise out of the Gulf of Mexico. A cruise in the middle of a kidnapping and a schmurder. He returned to Alaska on February 17th, and that's when he tried something new. He staged a fake ransom. He used Samantha's cell phone to text her boyfriend, pretending she was alive and demanding money. Then he took Samantha's body, applied makeup to make her look alive, braided her hair, and took a photo of her posed with a ransom note. Yep, that infamous ransom photo. He withdrew ransom money from her account in various states: Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, thinking he'd throw off the investigations, but authorities were tracking the ATM cards and the surveillance footage. And finally, in Texas, they spotted his rental car, pulled him over, and that's how Israel Keyes was caught on March 13th, 2012. He'd been flying under the radar for years, but that one simple mistake of using Samantha's debit card unraveled his years and years and years of his secret life. At first, Alaska police thought that they had just a single suspect connected only to see Samantha's case. They were bracing for a homicide, maybe a kidnapping conviction. They didn't know who they were dealing with quite yet. In Anchorage, Keyes was booked and quietly began talking, and what came out of his mouth blindsided everybody. He started dropping hints, saying, "There's more than just this one case, and I'm not your typical guy." Investigators realized they weren't dealing with a single crime. They were talking to someone who may have been hurting people for over a decade. And once the FBI realized how big this could be, they flew agents to Anchorage to conduct a series of interviews. For several months, Keyes met with FBI special agents Jeff Bell and Jolene Godin. The sessions were recorded, and those tapes are still some of the most chilling true crime material out there. Keyes didn't confess everything at once. He played games and offered small details. And then he would go quiet, or he would change the topic, or demand certain conditions. He didn't want his name all over the media. He worried it would hurt his family, especially his daughter. He demanded secrecy, sometimes threatening to stop talking if news stories kept running. He wanted to keep control even while sitting in his orange jumpsuit. One of the creepiest things that he said in those interviews were, "I'm two different people." And honestly, that was true, because on one side you had Israel Keyes, a quiet guy running a construction business, a father who went to his daughter's school events, and a boyfriend who seemed normal, if a little private, known for being polite and respectful. But then there was the other side. A man who'd been fantasizing about abduction and schmurder since his teenage years, who planned crimes years in advance, who buried kill kits across the country, and who would travel thousands of miles just to target strangers. He said, "I don't have an emotional connection to any of it. It's just a thing I do." Imagine sitting across from someone who has taken multiple lives, and they're so casually talking about it like they just changed their tire. Psychologists and profilers have called Keyes one of the most unusual offenders they've ever studied. Here's why he didn't fit that mold whatsoever. Many serial killers have a type, a certain look, gender, age. Keyes didn't. He said, "I didn't care who it was, just wanted someone who wouldn't make a fuss." He didn't have any connection to his victims. He purposely avoided attacking people he knew. He wanted nothing to link him back. Geographic randomness. Most serial killers stayed close to their comfort zone, and Keyes traveled all over the US. He deliberately picked faraway towns where he would blend in as a tourist. He had long gaps between his crimes. He would go years without acting. FBI profiler John Douglas, yes, the same John Douglas who inspired Mindhunter, said Keyes was the anti-Ted Bundy. Bundy wanted fame, and Keyes wanted to be invisible. During interrogations, Keyes kept bargaining. He said he'd reveal more victims, but only if authorities promised to not release details to the media. He hinted that there were at least 4 other murders besides the ones we knew, but refused names or locations. He said he'd talk if the state promised him the death penalty quickly instead of a drawn-out trial. At one point, he said, "I've got a lot more stories to tell, but I'm not going to sit in jail for 20 years while you guys decide what to do with me." Even in custody, he wanted control when the truth came out. Agents believed that he may be tied to the disappearance of solo hikers or campers, unsolved murders of young women, and cases near places where kill kits were found. But without any bodies, confessions, or any physical evidence, a lot of those cases still remain cold to these days. After he was arrested in March 2012, Keyes was held in a jail in Anchorage, and he was officially charged with kidnapping and murder in Samantha Koenig's case, and prosecutors were preparing a full trial. But the problem for investigators was they wanted him alive. They wanted him to keep talking so they could solve the other cases and give closures to families. Keyes, on the other hand, was getting increasingly agitated. He didn't want a drawn-out legal process, and he didn't want his name plastered across headlines for years. He said, "I want the death penalty, and I want it quickly." He offered a deal. If prosecutors gave him a quick execution, he would confess to the additional murders. He even gave hints to where the other bodies were. Prosecutors refused to make that deal because the justice system doesn't work like that, and they wanted the full truth. Keyes eventually started shutting down. He became less cooperative. The FBI tried several different strategies like offering snacks, changing rooms, changing agents, but Keyes stayed tight-lipped and wouldn't budge. On December 2nd, 2012, Israel Keyes was found in his jail cell, and he had ended his own life with a disposable razor that was hidden. He then used bed sheets to suffocate himself. When guards found him, he was already gone. And just like that, any chance of uncovering the crimes vanished with him. Here is one of the creepiest and most baffling parts of this story. Investigators found a 4-page note in his cell. It wasn't a confession, it wasn't a list of victims, it wasn't even anything to his family. Instead, it was basically a poem, a rambling, cryptic piece of writing filled with violent imagery, references to rivers of blood, and strange metaphors about nature and predation. No names, no dates, no apologies. Some of the lines read, "Your face framed in dark curls like a portrait. The sun shone through the highlights of red. Turned to ash with the rest of the dirt." It was unsettling to say the least, but unfortunately it was completely useless in the case. Key's death left investigators with more questions than answers. How many people did he really kill? Where are the unrecovered kits that he hinted about? How many missing person cases across the US are tied to him? Did he kill internationally? He traveled to Canada, Mexico, and possibly Belize. In total, the FBI currently suspects that he is connected to 11 different cases. But knowing what we know, it could definitely be more. But the problem is now that we no longer have Keyes and we no longer have his cooperation, some of those cases are going to be stuck in limbo forever. One of the most haunting pieces of evidence found after his arrest was a series of maps and drawings. He'd sketched maps showing places he visited. He'd drawn diagrams of roads, rivers, and rural areas, but he didn't label them with names, dates, or victim info. The FBI believes some of these maps might mark locations where bodies were buried, kill kits were hidden, or where he'd planned future crimes. And to this day, agents are still cross-referencing those drawings against missing person databases and cold cases. Key's case forced investigators to start rethinking how they're profiling these offenders. Traditionally, these profilers look for victim types, geographic patterns, cooling off periods, and behavioral signatures. And Keyes broke every single one of those rules. He proved that a methodical, intelligent killer can remain invisible for years if they don't repeat a pattern. John Douglas, legendary FBI profiler, said Keyes may be one of the most dangerous predators the US has ever seen because of his randomness. So after all of this, you might be asking, why does Israel Keyes still haunt the true crime world so much to this day? Because there are plenty of notorious killers who have taken more lives. But why does this guy keep popping up in podcasts, YouTube videos like this, documentaries, and Reddit threads? Because we still don't know how many crimes are tied to him. And ultimately, he haunts the world because he is the predator that nobody saw coming. He wasn't driven by passion or revenge. He was driven by pure opportunity. He wanted power and the ability to get away with it. Israel Keyes is proof that in a world full of security cameras, phone tracking, and DNA databases, a predator can still creep through if they are careful and patient enough. And I guess the real lesson is that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like the quiet guy who smiles at his neighbors, or a dad who takes his kid fishing. And that is what makes Israel Keyes one of the most terrifying figures in American history. If you're new here and you love true crime deep dives, definitely hit that sub button and drop your theories in the comments. Do you think Keyes' victim count was higher than we know? Do you think we'll ever solve the rest of his secrets? And until next time, stay safe out there.